Recording in progress. Awesome. Okay, so this week's Parsha is Parsha Vayera. There's a lot of really interesting things that happen in this week's Parsha. There's like really so much to talk about. I feel like you could talk about at the beginning, Abraham welcoming in all the guests and the angels. You could talk about the destruction of Sodom. You could talk about the weird interactions with Avimelech and how Abraham treats his wife Sarah through all of that. But I'm going to talk about probably the most famous of the stories that's in this week's Parsha, which is at the very end, which is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. I'm going to guess that for most of us here, that this is like not the first time they've ever thought about the story. However, I think that there's always something new to be gleaned every single time I read it. And it's often struggling with a lot of questions that I'm thinking about when it comes to morality and Judaism and what God expects of us. So hopefully that's going to come up in our conversation today. And I'm excited to see where it goes and hear what you guys have to say. So I'm going to put the link to the source sheet in the chat, as I usually do. And I will also share my screen so that some of us can follow along that way. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So I think in order to do this, well, even though a lot of us might be familiar with the story, I always think it's helpful to go back to the original text and see what it is. So I think it'd be really helpful to actually read the story of the binding of Isaac. It's actually not that long. It's only 12 psukim, which to me was like kind of surprising to remind myself because I feel like it's such a dramatic story. I imagine it to be a little bit longer or take up the entire chapter, but it doesn't. And that's like an interesting reminder, I guess, of how much valence something can take in our minds. But I think it'll be helpful for us to read, and then we can already begin the discussion going in. What I want to be thinking about, the question going in as we read, is what exactly is the test that God is providing Abraham? So I'm going to start reading, and then we'll discuss. Okay, the first verses with Genesis chapter 22. ויחי אחר דברים האלה, והאלוהים נישא את אברהם, ויאמר אליו אברהם, ויאמר הנני. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test, saying to him, Abraham. He answered, Here I am. ויאמר, קח נא את בנך, את יחידך, אשר אהבת את יצחק, ולך לך אל ארץ המוריה, ועליהו שם לעולה, על אחד ההרים אשר אומר אליך. Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. וישכים אברהם בבוקר, ויחבוש את חמורו, ויקח את שני נעריו איתו, ואת יצחק בנו, ויבקע עצי עולה, ויקום וילך אל המקום אשר אמר לו האלוהים. So Abraham woke up early in the morning. He saddled his donkey, and he took two young boys, servant boys, with him, and also Yitzchak, his son. They tied the wood that they were going to use for the sacrifice, and they got up and went to the place that God told them to go. ביום השלישי, ויישא אברהם את עיניו, וירא את המקום מרחוק. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar, supposedly the place that God was talking about. ויאמר אברהם אל נעריו, שבו לכם פה עם החמור, ואני והנער נלכה עד כה, ונשתחווה ונשובה עליכם. And Abraham said to the servants, you stay here with the donkey. I and this servant boy, I mean, ideally, I think we're talking about Yitzchak here, this young boy. We're going to go up until there and bow and return unto you. ויקח אברהם את עצי העולה, וישם את יצחק בנו, ויקח בידו את האש ואת המאכלת, וילכו שניהם יחדיו. So Abraham took the wood for the sacrifice and then put them on top of Isaac to carry them. And he took in his hand the fire and also the knife, and the two of them went together. Okay. So far, most people probably are very familiar with this imagery. ויאמר יצחק אל אברהם, אביו, ויאמר אבי, ויאמר הנני בני, ויאמר הנה האש והעצים, ואיה הסה לעולה. Yitzchak says to Abraham, his father, and says, my father. And then Abraham says, yes, I'm here, my son. And then Yitzchak says, here is the fire and here is the wood, but where is the sheep to be sacrificed? ויאמר אברהם, אלוהים יראה לו הסה לעולה בני וילכו שניהם יחדיו. Abraham says, God is going to show us the sheep in order to sacrifice. And then the two of them went together. ויבואו אל המקום אשר אמר לו האלוהים, ויבן שם אברהם את המזבח, ויערוך את העצים, ויעקוד את יצחק בנו, וישם אותו על המזבח ממעל לעצים. And the two of them went to the place that God told them, and Abraham builds a altar, and then lays out and binds the wood, binds Yitzhak to it, his son, and puts him on top of the altar, on top of the wood. Abraham sends his hand, like sends it in order to do the action, and takes the knife in order to kill his son. Abraham, Abraham, then an angel of God from the sky calls down to Abraham and says, Abraham, Abraham. And then he says, I am here. And then the angel said, do not strike your hand against the child or the young boy, and do not do anything to him, because now I know that you are God-fearing and that you would not withhold your son, your only son, from me. So a bit of a refresher for those of us who know the story. It still gives me chills every single time I read it, even though I knew what was going to happen, and I knew that ultimately Yitzhak was going to be okay. And there's obviously lots and lots to say about this, lots throughout Jewish history and Jewish literature. And I think that even though we might be familiar with a lot of it already, it's always helpful to kind of set the scene of where things are going. And I'm curious what you think the test was. I'll remember all the way back from the beginning of the story. It said that this whole thing was God testing Abraham. And so what do you make of that? And how are you feeling about that? And it's totally fine. If these are answers that maybe you feel like you've heard before, I think that's fine. I think now we're kind of framing the problem. So feel free to share what you think here. Yeah, sure.
So I've always read it as the test is to take your son and go sacrifice him to me. To test Abraham's willingness to do that. I've never really appreciated this test.
Yes, there's I mean, not like a typical school test, I guess, but like it seems that, right, the test, like I think from the regular pshat, literal understanding, is that we wanted to see if Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, and seems like yes, even if there's a lot of problems that come with that. Yeah. Audrey, would you like to say something?
Sure, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know how to put the hand down right now.
Oh, you're doing great.
Okay. I thought the test was just, will you do what I tell you to do? No matter how you might feel about it or how abhorrent we might think it is, it's just literally, will you follow the command?
Yeah, I think definitely it's on the one hand, like not really about Yitzhak, it's just seeing how far Abraham could go, but it's by using Yitzhak as the collateral. It's like really to show, is Abraham willing to go as far as he can against his own personal will, maybe, in order to do God's command. This is like the paradigm of that. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to share? Yeah, Barry. Oh, I think you're on mute, Barry, so I can't hear.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you.
No problem.
I've been around this block a couple of times. I was abhorred a lot about this when I first heard it, because I thought, why isn't there some other better way to test Abraham's loyalty? And then it suddenly dawned on me not long ago. It could have been earlier this year or something. I just realized that, and to dispose of the one thing, I used to wonder, what is it with sacrificing Yitzchak that Abraham has to do, and why does God call it off? How does that happen once it's in motion? And I've been told by more than one reliable, credible source that I trust for good information, that the test wasn't intended to be Yitzchak, Abraham sacrificed Yitzchak. It was to be take him up to the mount. So whichever one of my esteemed classmates who said the test was to see if Abraham would do what he was told to do. I've had a couple of teachers, if you will, tell me that the teaching was the test was going up to the mount with Yitzchak, not sacrificing Yitzchak. And then it suddenly occurred to me, they went through the whole thing, and Yitzchak goes up with Abraham, and they're going as one. There's Rashi commentary to the text that the text is in the singular in places, so that it tells us that Abraham and Yitzchak were of one mind and one heart. They were both in this. And I suddenly realized earlier this year that this was a twofer. This was Abraham being tested to do God's will, and so was Yitzchak to participate in it. And this is where God sees not only that Abraham has obeyed his way and has not held back his only son, his only beloved son, but Yitzchak has grabbed on to Abraham's ways, and he is the suitable, fitting heir for what becomes the Jewish people. So this is it. I think it's a twofer. They both had their chance to shine, and they obviously did. I'm good with this.
Yeah, I mean, I love shining moments. I don't know if I'd want to be that here, but yes, I think there's right. It seems clear in like the literal reading of the text that the goal is to sacrifice Isaac, but there are a lot of times throughout the text where it's unclear if that's like exactly what's supposed to pan out. Like for me, what really strikes me every time is Abraham speaking to those two servant boys and saying, "Oh, like don't worry, like me and Yitzhak are just going to go bow. We're going to come back." And so it could totally be like a white lie to cover what actually is about to happen. Or it could be that Abraham like really had faith that was going to be what happens. And I think that the text, I mean, just like the amazing other texts throughout the Jewish corpus, like has so many different reads and that teach us so many different things. So yeah, I think we've covered like a lot of I think we've covered that it's a test that involves seeing how far Abraham can go in his faith with God, with something that's deeply morally problematic and troubling, and kind of expressing the trouble we might have with that. And I think that's why this story is so paramount in so many ways, and why it appears in so much, I'd say, like Judeo-Christian artwork, and it's also incredibly important for Christianity. It's a very powerful story. And whether we like the conclusion or not, it all, I think, makes us react in a certain way. And really brings us into this question, like, what is the nature of religion? What is the nature of morality? And how is God in between all those things? So great. So we've like pretty much laid out the problem. I want to go to the Gemara sources. First, I have, it's a really fun one. For those of you who have learned Pirkei Avot before, I think with the fathers, there's in the 5th chapter, lots of lists of tens. And there's an amazing list of things that were created. On first like during the 6 days of creation, but specifically right before Shabbat. And it's interesting to see what shows up in the list. And I wonder if it can give us an idea of maybe what was God's intentions for this test. It might give us a little more insight to that. So the text goes the following. 10 things were created on the eve of the Sabbath at twilight, and these were them. Ve'eluhen, pi haaretz, upi ha'be'er, pi ha'aton v'ha'keshet, v'haman v'ha'mateh v'ha'shamir v'ha'ktav v'ha'michtav v'ha'luchot. So 1 is the mouth of the earth, 2 is the mouth of the well, 3 is the mouth of the donkey, 4 is the rainbow, 5 is man, 6 is the staff of Moshe, 7 is the shamir, 8 is the letters, 9 is the writing, and 10 is the tablets. So these are, I mean, it's fun to see. There's like a bunch of stuff with mouths. I think that's like how they're collecting it. All these things are different, really miraculous things, right? Like the mouth of the earth, that's what swallows Korach and his rebellious people. The mouth of the donkey is talking about the donkey that spoke to Bilam, right? And that's a miraculous thing. Last night I checked, donkeys don't talk to us. The rainbow, the man, the staff of Moshe that turns into the snake. All of these things are incredibly fantastical. And so the idea is like, they're so fantastical that they have to be like they're almost like made in this twilight zone, right? They're made right before Shabbat begins. During sunset, it's a liminal space. So like now we have all these fun, fantastical things that are being created there. However, there's a potential extension to the list. Marilyn wrote in the chat, what is the shamir? I believe, and if other people know, feel free to correct me, the shamir is like a special worm that was able to create like these amazing garments in the Beit HaMikdash and the Mishkan. And so it's like miracle worm. And so it was on there. I'm not totally sure. I believe that's what it is. I'm happy to follow up and check with this afterward, but if anyone else knows, feel free to jump in. Okay, but the list, even though we just listed 10 and 10 is a great typological number, there's potentially more. And what are they? V'shomrim af hamazikin v'kurato shel Moshe ve'elo shel Avraham Avinu. But maybe there's more. The demons might have been created then, the grave of Moshe, and the ram of Avraham, our father. V'yeshomrim, and this is my favorite one, and some say, and all af tzivat v'tzivat asuya. And some say also tongs made with tongs. Because it seemed like a funny point. These are tongs that were used in the Beit HaMikdash, like in order to do all the incense and all the other sacrifices. And it's this like funny problem where they're like, well, in order to make tongs, you had to like dip it into like hot water. And so you needed a tong the first time, like you needed the first ever tong to be able to make all the other future tongs. So it's like funny that that's like such a philosophical conundrum for them. They need like a miracle time for that to be created. I'll say as a fun tangent, a friend of mine got married a few months ago, and a friend of mine, like on her wedding registry, we like explicitly bought the tongs because we were referencing this Pirkei Avot that she needed. We're like, tongs are very miraculous. So if you ever are looking for like a good gift idea and want some Torah, this is great. But what's very interesting here is that the ram that eventually, we didn't read this part in the story, but the ram that comes to save the day when we've learned that Avram passes the test, we've set up an altar. Why not sacrifice something? Avram sees that there is a ram that's stuck in the bushes and then sacrifices that instead of Yitzchak. So here it seems to be that it was created all the way at the beginning of creation to be able to solve this problem. I'm curious what you think about this being the example. And I also would like to note that it's not in the original list, right? There's the 10. But it says Vayeshomrim, that some people contest otherwise. And maybe what are the potential problems that could come with this being something that was created at the beginning of the world? And what does that tell us about this story?
This is Leah.
Yeah, Barry, go for it.
This is Leah. I don't
hi,
think
Leah.
these
Hi,
things
Leah.
are random.
Mhm.
I think they are all a collection of events to come that mark the beginning of faith. For example, the mouth of the donkey points to that Parsha where Balaam, and there's the donkey, and the donkey thinks it sees an angel, and the donkey just balks and then starts talking. It's awareness of what's holy. That's what the donkey sees. Even a simple animal is aware of something that's holy. And the rainbow, to me, marks the beginning of faith, that what God does is for our own good. And the mouth of the well, I'm thinking about the story of Joseph, who ended up in the well. I think it's the beginning of faith and greatness. They're not random. They're all beginning points.
Yeah, that's great. I love the rainbow in particular, because the rainbow isn't like the most miraculous. It's something that happens in natural events. But with your framing, Leah, saying actually it's about the beginning of faith, like it's about what the rainbow represents. And of course, it's referencing the rainbow at the end of the Noah story. So I think that's a really good read, that these are all things that are paramount to that. And maybe the ram is that as well. Yeah, Barry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, first I want to compliment Leah. You enlightened me on a point of view. It's really great to think about that. I want to ask your forgiveness and the forgiveness of the class for wanting to make a nitpicking comment. I want to split a hair here. The ram of Abraham, is it not what I have come to feel is the ram of Yitzchak? And Abraham uses the ram to sacrifice, but he's sacrificing Yitzchak. And then there's commentary about when God says, I shall remember, I will remember my covenant with Yaakov, I shall remember Yitzchak. I shall remember my covenant with Yaakov and with Yitzchak, and my covenant with Abraham I will remember. And I read commentary that we don't have God remembering the covenant with Yitzchak because the ashes of the ram that was actually sacrificed is sitting right there on earth for God to see. So God doesn't need to be reminded of the covenant with Yitzchak. There's nothing other, there's no other reminders, I guess, other than God remembering those covenants with Yaakov and Abraham, but he doesn't have to remember Yitzchak. And also the commentaries that go with some of the sacrifices along the way throughout Torah. And bull, the ox bull is usually allied with Abraham, and ram with Yitzchak, and sheep or lamb with Yaakov Avinu. So that's what I wanted to pick that one. How come somebody said ram of Abraham?
That's I've never heard this this understanding about the ashes. That's very interesting.
Oh,
But
yeah,
I think in this,
I loved it when I read it.
yeah, it's very interesting. There's you will see in the sources coming up where like the discussion is like, wait, why is like Abraham's story, like poor Yitzchak, he's the one who's kind of put through this and victimized. Like as much as we feel bad for Abraham, like he wasn't the one lying on the altar. And I think that that's like kind of that problem. I think also here what's like built into it is that by saying it's the ram of Abraham's, that was like Abraham's intention, that like this was going to be the end game, which I think says a lot. Like, well, if the goal was for him to do something that was like the most morally apprehensible to him to prove the point, then like if he's had the ram in mind, what does that mean? Audrey, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. I like this list because for me it's a little bit mystical, and it seems to speak from a people without science. You know, how do we explain the rainbow, the manna, the shamir? I had to look up shamir. But demons, but then what made me laugh was tongs. And I liked your example that you give it as a wedding present. But I also have been reflecting that perhaps the original authors of this text, however it was transmitted, didn't anticipate that anyone would assign it profound meaning, and that they would have a later audience that would really dig into tongs and, you know, the shamir. But, you know, I don't know. But yeah, the tongs part really gets me.
It's so funny. Yeah. So it was using the Vietnamese, but it's like, yeah, it feels to me like this very funny philosophical problem of like they're just so concerned about like how did the first tongs get made. But yeah, no, I think that you bring up like a lot of good points, that there's definitely a lot of mystical points here, and it's a great question about like the whole nature of Torah Shabbat Peh, like how much were the rabbis anticipating all of us to like be going through every single letter, every single jot and tittle for the whole thing. That could like be a great question about what the nature of Torah Shabbat Peh is altogether. What I want to do is I want to be able to move on to the next source because there's still a lot for us to do. I want to make sure that we finish. But the reason why I wanted to bring this source to clarify is I think we could wonder when looking at the original text, like what was God's goal, right, with this text? And we were saying like, oh, it's to show Abraham's faith, and there's no way that God really could have wanted Yitzchak to have died. And I think that this text really articulates that by saying that the ram was created all the way at the beginning of the creation of the world. That's saying from the get-go that there was already a substitute available for Yitzchak that was like built into the framework of the universe. And I think that that's what this text is suggesting, like by putting it with all these other mystical things, that it's something that is more powerful than just being a regular ram, but that this is like an answer to that theological question of, oh, if you were so worried that maybe God really wanted Yitzchak to have been sacrificed, don't worry, built within the framework of the universe, which is morality and what God wants us to begin with, like this is there. But then I think then it's also important to note that it's not in the list of 10, it's in the Vayera Omrim, that some people say. So that already shows that it's somewhat contested. Like I'm saying, well, it's fantastic. It shows it's in like the framework of the creation of the world, that God is good and God would never want Yitzchak to have died in the process. But not everyone seems to agree. And I think that is picking up on this potential tension. So now I want to go to our other source in Masechet Tanis, This is actually from the Mishnah, and that's going to be relevant because we're going to look at a source from the Jerusalem Talmud, which, although the text of the Gemara is different than the Babylonian Talmud that we usually study, it's still the shared Mishnah. So here I have it based off of the pagination of the Babylonian Talmud, but this is just a regular Mishnah, Masechet Tani. And Masechet Tani is all about when people need to fast, right? That's what a Tani is. And in a world where everyone was more agriculturally connected to the world, whenever there was famines, the idea was that if Bnei Israel fasted for half days and blew shofar and had these amazing prayer experiences, that then the famine would be over. So a lot of the Mishnayot are about what that service looked like. And so what I think is very interesting is it includes the beginning of the prayer service. They would blow all these shofars. They would stand in the middle of like the town square, have the Aron Kodesh there, and then they'd start praying, and you might recognize the prayer. I'm going to read in English for the sake of time. So it says the following. And he, the Shalech Tzibor, the leader of the group, recites at the end of all of these 6 blessings their unique conclusions. For the conclusion of the first blessing, Redeemer of Israel, he recites, he who answered Abraham on Mount Moriah, he will answer you and hear the sound of your cry on this day. Blessed are you, Lord, Redeemer of Israel. The second blessing, to which he adds the verses of remembrances, he recites, he who answered our forefathers at the Red Sea, he will answer you and hear the sound of your cry on this day. Blessed are you, Lord, who remembers the forgotten. So the Hebrew, maybe this will be a little bit more recognizable, is the part about Abraham and Mount Moriah is Misha Anav Abraham Bahar Moriah Huyan Etzem. These verses, even though they're in the Mishnah, are taken and put into our Slichot service that we say at the end of, well, for Sfaradim, they say all of Elul. For Ashkenazim, we say at the end of Elul, and then into the high holiday season. It's an amazing tefillah of different collections of when God answered X biblical character during a difficult time, so too God should answer us. So the idea is that the tefillah invokes different times in Jewish history in which God answered our ancestors, and therefore we should be able to be answered too during hard times. Now, there's a bit of a problem with this text, which is he who answered Abraham on Har Moriah suggests that Abraham reached out and cried out for help on Har Moriah. And last time I checked, when we read our biblical text at the beginning, that was not clear in the text whatsoever that happened. In the text that we have, God commands Abraham to take his son and to sacrifice him. And Abraham is really ready to go. We don't see any kind of protest. We don't see any kind of prayer wishing that, he could do otherwise or asking for strength. This is a different understanding of what that story is. And I think it's very interesting that that's what the rabbis are interested in crafting in this prayer. It seems to me that they want to suggest a different kind of layer to the story than we're used to. Yeah, Barry?
I'm recalling what you just read a few minutes ago about Yitzchak asking Abraham, Father, Hineni, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide a sacrifice. I think that was Abraham's prayer. And the words, the text of Abraham's response, however it is, it really emotionally sat within Abraham as a plea and a prayer to God. Provide me a sacrifice for this boy.
Yeah.
I that's how I see it.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to say anything? Leah, were you gonna share something? Yeah, I think that I could see it in the text. I also do think, though, to push back a bit, that there are other times where biblical characters really do explicitly call out. Like I think that
Agreed.
A good example would be like King David throughout all of Psalms, right? Like calling out in his angst towards God. That's an explicit call out. Also, Moshe healing his brother and sister when they have tsarat, when they have leprosy. Like there are explicit times where there is calling out and then God responds. And that's still not in the text. But I do hear, like, I think that there's ample opportunity within the text that we have to like read in that maybe Abraham wanted things to be different. But I think that it's a very interesting push that it said this explicitly, like to the God that answered Abraham on Har Moriah during this test. So too, should you answer us? Like also, like, I don't know what, like that would be the the prime example, that was like a very difficult time. And it's interesting that this is the paradigm for them that they want to be invoking. Before we move on to the next text, does anyone want to share anything? Any thoughts, reactions?
Hi, this is Audrey. I was
Yeah,
just
go.
thinking about kind of an evolution of how we're seeing man go from last time I was here, building towers up to the sky, to now just unquestioningly submitting to the will of God and, using some soft psychology to get their child and others to remain calm while, as far as we know, they believe they're about to sacrifice their child. So maybe this story is important because it just illustrates that someone is submitting themselves to God's will, whether or not he actually believed that he was going to have to kill his child. That we should look at this as an example of just like really having faith in God.
Yeah, I think something that really struck me the first time I ever saw this, but there's a lot of text from the time of the Crusades, a lot of different poems that were written by Jews in the Crusades at that time that really actually idolized this experience of Abraham sacrificing his child, because there were so many times, unfortunately, in the Crusades where like really these split-second decisions need to be made about either you become Christian or you sacrifice your child. And it's like it's pretty haunting that they find a sense of representation in the Abraham sacrificing Yitzchak story. And so it's like quite jarring when you read it, but it's also like it's fascinating that this can be really comforting for people in a weird way. Just say like sometimes you have to submit, and sometimes scary things happen, and we have to make difficult decisions. So Audrey, that's what I was reminded of when you were talking about that. I'm sure famine was a really difficult time for people. It's something that is a little bit distant in our memory now, or like difficult to relate to, but maybe actually saying like there are really extreme things in the world, and sometimes we have to make really intense decisions. Maybe there's comfort in knowing that our ancestors had to do that also. So yeah, it's a hard one. It reminds me a little bit more of our discussion last week. We were discussing about like in times of persecution, what mitzvot are allowed to be overridden in order to save a life or not. Like it's difficult text, but sometimes in difficult times, it's helpful to relate to things like that. So yeah, thank you. I want to go now to the Jerusalem Talmud that I think provides a very interesting read on what's happening, that helps us think a little bit more about also this point of like, are we submitting? Are we not submitting? We're like a little frustrated that it was only Avraham being focused, but Yitzchak is the one being sacrificed. And I think that this section of the Yerushalmi of the Jerusalem Talmud kind of speaks to that. So it starts off, but was not Isaac redeemed? Meaning they had that text that we just read, because that was from the Mishnah, that who answered Avraham on Har Moriah, so too that God should answer us. So the text questions, wait a minute, why are we talking about Abraham? Abraham wasn't answered on Mount Moriah. It was Yitzchak. Yitzchak was the one who was panicking, about to be sacrificed. Why aren't we saying that this is about answering Yitzchak? Which I think, Barry, you brought up like a few minutes ago already. Like, where's Yitzchak in all of this? Like, why are we focusing on like Avraham and the ram? Like, this is really a Yitzchak story and his success story of being saved. So yes, right. So yeah, so I think that bringing up this question is like the opportunity to bring Yitzchak back into the story. So what did it say? Since Isaac was redeemed, as if all of Israel was redeemed. Rabbi Bavai Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Avraham said before the Holy One, praise to him, Master of the worlds, it is open and known before you that when you said to me to sacrifice my son Isaac, I could have answered and said before you, yesterday you said to me, for in Isaac your descendants shall be named, and now you're saying sacrificing his elevation offering. Heaven forbid that I should have done this. To the contrary, I suppressed my inclination and did your will. So what this text is suggesting, when talking about the redemption, and the Maharsha, who's a medieval commentator, the 1500s, he was a commentator on this passage, talks about that what seems to be suggested in this reading is that actually maybe the original conclusion was that Isaac was going to die, and that was actually what God wanted. But then the ultimate test was that Abraham learned to push back and was able to pray for Yitzchak's behalf to be saved. And that actually changed the entire nature of the framework of like what was about to happen. And that is why we focus on Abraham in particular, because he was the one who was able to override this sense of Gzeira, of I guess like what was supposed to, this decree that was going to be happening to Yitzchak. And what Abraham is saying here is he was saying, I could have said these things to you, God. I could have said right away, you promised me a child, and now you're telling me to get rid of that child. But I didn't when you first told me. But now I'm about to sacrifice my son, and I deserve better. And this isn't right. And so that's why the focus on Abraham being like the agent of prayer here. But what I just think is so interesting in contrast to like the story that we had about the ram being created all the way at the time of creation, problem solved. God doesn't actually want Yitzchak to be sacrificed. That in this version of the story, there's a real chance that God actually wanted that, but then the ultimate power was seeing that Abraham could challenge something like that, which I thought is a very different read, right? It's almost like a different notion of what the test was. Is the test merely to see how far Abraham would go in his worship of God, or maybe the test is to see, like, as someone who is now a part of a covenant, what does it mean to be in covenant with God? Does it mean having, true submission, or is it maybe about being in relationship and therefore pushing back when things feel wrong? And I think it's really interesting that this is what the text in the Yerushalmi kind of brings out. Does anyone have any thoughts about that before we continue? Yeah, very.
I had a thought earlier that I don't want to forget, so I'm going to say it now. It's got more than one place in this topic that we've been discussing for a while. I have read somewhere in commentary, or maybe it's somebody's opinion on the composure of God, that God does not present us a problem, that God does not present to us a problem for which there is not already a solution that we have to figure out what to do. So the ram, whoever it's for, and I think it's for both, at the time of creation, could be answered in one of two ways. And as soon as you start taking leaps of query and stretching one's mind, I had a professor that once called it mental gymnastics, to push yourself, to push oneself into thinking beyond the mere text and figure out what's going on. As soon as you start doing that, you start creating possibilities that for which there is no text, or the text is merely suggestive, but you can take it that way. And one of the things that just occurred to me now is that could have been both. Could have been when this whole thing started, God did not anticipate the sacrifice of Yitzchak, and so he was ready and had ready the solution to the problem, just for Abraham to have it and Yitzchak to have it. But then again, who knows? If you're saying that text isn't there, so why are we thinking these things? Or what could this be? Then it could have been that there was sinning going on, and that somebody had said or felt or thought something that's outside the text, but for which sacrifice was God's way of punishment, of cleaning the slate. And both Yitzchak and Abraham together, son and father, father-son, redeemed themselves and did tshuva as they're going up the mountain. And so here comes the ram again. So I think you can fashion an answer to this.
Yeah,
but it has to be fashioned. There's no way to say it. This is it. I think it has to be fashioned.
Yeah, I think that it is a story that is both like only in a few verses, but also like probably was a roller coaster of emotion, and different things were being felt at different times. And it's funny because like I don't often think about like God, I guess, being like that, because God is like all knowing, but maybe God also had maybe different plans of how everything was going to pan out. Like the source that the ram was always there was always true, but also maybe there was a real chance that Yitzchak really wasn't going to make it. And then like, what do we do about that? And maybe all of that is possible. Audrey, yeah, do you want to share?
Sure, thank you. I was reading like book reviews before we started tonight, and one of the books is called Life is Hard. So something that I was
Really?
Right, it's called Life is Hard. Here, I have it right here. It's How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way by Kiran Satya. It's 240 pages. But what I was thinking was that that life is hard, and that God could have taken his son through illness. Someone else could have attempted to murder him. There's many ways in which God takes people's lives. And so that this, though, an extreme example, is yet another example of how life is hard. And, maybe there's an angle on this story that is, there's not much more than there's a lot of suffering and hard things that you have to go through living your life. And every once in a while, a mystical ram or a mystical worm or some tongs present themselves.
Yeah. I think the text in the Yerushalmi in particular, and it matches the text. It's one of my favorite passages in the Machzor as well, for Rosh Hashanah, where this idea of like Avram saying, "I'm doing this with my emotions, so God, you need to do this with your emotions. Like I am overcoming my sense of compassion in order to do what you want. So now it's your turn to overcome your sense of anger." It's also like a balancing act, but like also it's like amazing that Avram can have this powerful relationship and bargain with God, but also like in real life, what does that bargain look like? And often we don't have like clear answers of like transactional. Okay, it's God's turn to be, overcoming God's sense of anger and not like, I think that we could read it as like Avram dealing with a lot of pain in the world. Totally. Yeah, Leah.
Hi, this is Leah.
Hi.
This question about redemption, for some reason, has me thinking about the story of Noah and the ark. I'm thinking about how at first God was planning to just do away with the world, forget about it, they're no good. And yet he saves Noah. And here in the story, Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac. And I think, God was thinking to himself, oh, what am I doing? He begins to show compassion, and he has to change a plan and decides to redeem him. It's like saying, it's like God is saying to himself, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? Change my plans, redeem him, save them. The world is not all horrible. Save the people who are worth saving.
Yeah, I think that throughout Jewish history, there's been like a real desire to try and take away the opportunities to anthropomorphize God and not give God emotions, because it could limit God. But I think there's something very powerful of God almost feeling like kind of frustrated and overwhelmed, like, oh, like no one's really doing what I want. Like I just want to start fresh. And then the role of the Nevi'im and the prophets are like, no, God, like it's okay. Like we're gonna figure this out. Like it's a funny image, but I think it's quite beautiful, and I think it happens a lot. Like I think also about like Moshe, like after the sin of the golden calf, like also God is ready to start fresh again. And then Moshe says, well, if you're gonna do that, you have to erase me too. Like a reminder of like, it's okay. Like I'm sorry you feel that way, but really it's better to like try and find the good that is here. And I think actually, I think that actually really connects to the last source that I want to talk about, which is the takeaway. That's what I usually try and do at this point. We have our Tanakh sources, our Gemara sources, and now let's like try and find some synthesis. In the beginning of the Parsha is the discussion of Stom that I mentioned before. And a powerful passage is about when Abraham is with God, I guess, looking at Stom, and God's like, guess what I'm about to do? I'm about to destroy Stom. And Avram is so frustrated. And so he begins bargaining with God, saying, what if there were 50 righteous people? What if there were 40 righteous people? Going all the way to what if there was one, talking about his nephew Lot. And that's ultimately what helps God determine to go save Lot and his family before his destruction begins. And that model of talking and bargaining with God is very different than the model of the Akedah. So we think, right? Like from the first reading that we had. But a lot of the stories that we were seeing so far seem to be struggling with the idea of like, well, maybe actually Abraham should have been fighting more, or also like maybe it's built in within the whole story, right? Misha Anna Abraham Bahar Moria, maybe Abraham was pushing back and praying to God even then. And Rabbi David Hartman, who is a rabbi that was probably in the late 20th century, a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University, but he had a very expansive way of thinking. He started the Shalom Hartman Institute that's still around today, that same Hartman. And he has amazing books of theology that I find really interesting. And he talks about this model of Abraham 1 and Abraham 2. Some people might be familiar with Rabbi Soloveitchik's model of Adam 1 and Adam 2, reading the two versions of the creation story as like two different paradigms of man. That like the first Adam is one that conquers, and the second Adam is much more existential, and we have to be both. And so Rabbi Hartman kind of takes this model of saying, actually, maybe there's like two paradigms of what Abraham is. There's like an Abraham 1 and an Abraham 2, the Abraham of Sodom and then the Abraham of the Akedah story. And what can that teach us about our own prayer experience? So I'm going to read the following. This is from his book, A Heart of Many Rooms. It's all about like what is the nature of pluralism within a Jewish halachic discourse. It's a really great book. Okay. The God of Abraham, therefore, takes two very different forms in the book of Genesis. A God who demands total surrender to his command, and a God who invites independent moral critique and judgment. These two paradigms have informed religious life as well as interpretation and exegesis throughout Jewish history. For many teachers from the time of the Talmud to the modern period, including Yeshayahu Leibowitz and my own teacher, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, was a dominant paradigm of religious life and thought. For them, the survival and continuity of the tradition require the unconditional surrender and loyalty that the Akedah represents. Yet, Abraham, in pleading for Sodom, felt that God was not beyond his own understanding of moral argument and persuasion. This other paradigm, therefore, says, bring your moral intuitions, your subjective sense of dignity and justice into your understanding of the reality of God. Not only does it not threaten or undermine religious consciousness, but it actually is necessary for recognizing the validity and applicability of the divine command. So I think this passage is fascinating. I think what he's suggesting is that there's two different models of how to confront God and things. One could be total surrender, like seemingly the literal understanding of the story of the Akedah. Just do what God says. Sometimes life is hard. Sometimes there's pain. But sometimes it's important to be able to protest and to feel empowered. I love the articulation in the second paragraph where he's saying like, you are, only Abraham starts off that protest saying, I'm but dust and ashes. And yet I am empowered to be able to talk to you in this way. And even though I am human and therefore I am fallible and you're God, I still am empowered to be able to bring up my concerns with you. And by both of the stories being within the Torah, there's an understanding that like both of those models are appreciated and welcomed within Judaism. There doesn't necessarily have to always be a sense of blind faith. And so I think with a lot of what we saw today, it could be like there's the Sodom model and then there's the Akedah model. But I actually think even within the Akedah story itself, there could be different models of what this is, right? We could have the understanding that the ram was there from the get-go. God never would have wanted this to go so far. So that's good. That puts God in like a more morally safe camp. And when that means that like total submission wasn't necessarily the case. We don't have to submit when things feel problematic to us. So that by having the ram all the way from the beginning of the creation story, we are assured that God is still moral. We could have the idea of, well, no, like there was a chance that Yitzchak really could have died. And it's like very special and important that Abraham was able to protest. And then the Misha Ana Abraham, Bahar Moria, the idea that like, we don't know exactly what was asked, but that we are able to invoke that paradigm whenever we are struggling, to say like, we're actually allowed to ask God for things, even when God suggests otherwise. All of those things can be true, and all of those things can be a part of the religious experience. And they don't have to be one contradictory, but two, like we are actually welcome to do both, and even welcome to protest and critique. I think is a really refreshing way to be thinking about religion. I think that's often not how it's portrayed nowadays, especially like in social media, modern understandings of what religion is. But there's a lot of agency and also a lot of welcomed partnership between human beings and God, and that true partnership means being able to push back and ask questions. So I love this piece. I think that this Abraham 1, Abraham 2 is Fantastic. And maybe it also can also be within the Akedah story itself and not just within stone. Does anyone have anything they want to share about that? Yeah, very.
I gotta share what I've been reading throughout Lech Lecha, and I went ahead into Vayera, or we are reading Vayera. But God teaches us things along the way, even back from the beginning of Reshit. Rashi comments a great deal about God teaching us ways. God consults his court, teaching us that when we have impactful, profound things to consider, to decide, we should seek good counsel. Even in this parsha, Abraham had been circumcised, I believe, and he was healing, and yet he was at the mouth of his tent on the third day from the circumcision, and he's looking and waiting for. He hasn't seen visitors because God hasn't sent him any, and none have come along, and nor has God sent him any. And Abraham was longing for these, for some visitors, for some living to do, and God sends his messengers in human form to do that, says Rashi's commentary, because God is compassionate for Abraham. And the visitors come so far, then they stand by the tree, and they linger because they're respectful for Abraham's discomfort, and they wait for him to a point to see what he wants to do. There's this going on throughout Torah so far, and it'll keep on going. That God teaches us lessons, and at those moments of learning lessons, that's our. I think I see that as our time to ask, and to open up, and to learn, whether it's a Socratic method like Abraham and God going back and forth, or that wasn't Socratic, but the exchange. How about 10 guys? How about 9 guys? Righteousness. Lot had his own merit, maybe from Egypt, when Lot kept his mouth shut and didn't rat on Abraham being Sarah's husband and not her brother. There are times when I think God wants us to push back and learn, and yet when it comes down to us pushing back too far, there's a line that we can't cross. So it's kind of a mixed world for me.
Yeah, I think that having both the Abraham 1 and Abraham 2 models are there, right? Like, I definitely lean more to like, oh, it's great to ask questions, and in order to learn, loha by sham lo mid, that like if you're embarrassed to ask questions, you're not going to be able to learn well. At the same time, like the Abraham 2 model, the Akedah, still exists, and there is value to it sometimes. And it's being able to figure out like in what context do you want to invoke which kind of Abraham, I think. And that, what that looks like is a great question. Like, how do you figure that out? But at least what we do know is that both of them are options to us, and hopefully that can be comforting in and of itself. Yeah. Does anyone have any final words, thoughts? Awesome. Great. Yeah, I think that really Rabbi Hartman says it all. So hopefully this story, the Akedah, we have seen it many times before. Hopefully, in the way we studied it today, we have a whole different understanding of like what was Abraham's sense of agency throughout all of this, what was Abraham asking for in a time that is supposedly complete submission. And hopefully we can be empowered in our own lives to be oscillating between the Abraham 1, Abraham 2 models, and figure out when it's worth acknowledging the pain and the difficulty, and when can we push back and ask for more. And hopefully we can take that with us into our own lives. So thank you so much for everyone coming this evening. It's so nice to see you all here. And I look forward to being with you all next week.
Sure, great class. Good comments.
Thank you so much. Great job, everyone.
Good comments. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for the participation, everyone.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Mm.
Bye.